I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging that we're coming to you all from the homelands of the Lenape people. The Lenape people were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over a course of 400 years on the lands now known as New York City in the United States of America.
My name is Megan Spindler-Smith. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the Deputy CEO of People with Disability Australia, or PWDA for short. I am a dark-haired, pale-skinned person with thin-rimmed glasses, red lipstick, and I am wearing a green floral top. I'm going to play you an artwork. This artwork is called Keeping, and it is by Daniel McDonald, a deaf Aboriginal Gadigal artist. Daniel is one of our speakers today, and you will learn more about the artwork in Daniel's video. PWDA is a national cross-disability rights and advocacy organisation. We are led by and for people with disability, representing the diverse 5.5 million Australians who identify as having a disability. We are also the national peak for LGBTQIA+ people with disability in Australia. When we advocate for our community, we speak from lived experience, from deep community connections, and from the front line of systems that too often exclude, exploit, or ignore us. Joining me today is Tahlia-Rose Vanissum, a First Nations person with disability.
Hi everyone, my name is Tahlia-Rose Vanissum. I am a Woppaburra woman, a traditional custodian and owner of my saltwater homelands, Konomi and Woppa, now known as the Keppel Islands, located at the southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, Australia. I use she, her pronouns, have bright pink hair, glasses and a pink jacket, we're seeing a theme there, and I'm a proud Indigenous woman with a disability and a carer for my disabled Woppaburra mother. And I'm glad to be joining you all today as a member of People with Disability Australia.
I'm now going to play you the artwork called Keeping by Daniel McDonald.
Today we are here to listen, learn, and discuss restrictive practices through a storytelling approach that lets you hear directly from some of our community members with disability and the lived experiences of restrictive practices. Restrictive practices breach people with disabilities' fundamental human rights and are particularly problematic for multiply marginalised groups, in particular our First Nations people with disability in Australia. However, authorised and unauthorised restrictive practices continue to be used against people with disability around the world in various settings, such as psychiatric facilities, prisons, schools, and disability group homes. These practices can lead to physical and psychological harm, including lifelong trauma for people with disability.
In this session, we will hear from 3 First Nations people about their experiences with restrictive practices. Before we start, I have some important accessibility and tech tips to ensure everyone gets the most out of this event. We have Auslan interpreters and live captions available. To view captions, press the CC icon in your Zoom toolbar. We encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function. We will try to answer as many as we can following each speaker's presentation finishing. We encourage everyone to use the chat box to share your comments and connect. When interacting in this meeting, all comments and discussions should be respectful.
So we're going to start today with a video of Auntie Angela Brown, a proud Nyampa, Wollawon and Namba woman living on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. Auntie Angela is a person with musculoskeletal disease, and Auntie Ange brings a powerful lived experiences of the barriers, treatments and daily challenges faced by people with disability. Throughout her life, Auntie Ange has witnessed and experienced restrictive practices, from the systemic exclusion of people with disability in workplaces to decisions made without consent in health and support settings.
My name's Angela Brown, and I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which I reside, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and those who are growing to become elders. I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Nations peoples who, like us, have survived colonisation. I'm a Nyampa, Wollawon Namba woman, and I live in Canberra, ACT. As a person with musculoskeletal disease, I've experienced the barriers, treatments, opportunities and needs that a person with a musculoskeletal disease confronts on a daily basis. I also have a very good understanding of the healthcare system and how it operates, given my frequent flyer visits to the emergency result of medications that cause me to be immunocompromised. I wanted to talk first a bit about, my work. I started work at the age of 12. My mother hired me out to a family to do their washing, ironing and making lunches. I graduated from that to shop work, and I retired at the age of 63 after a lifetime of working hard. My working life was mostly with First Nations peoples, including cancer support for families with a member who'd been diagnosed, and I offered advice, support and grief and bereavement counselling. I managed the Pharmacy Guild pharmaceutical scholarships for First Nations peoples, and from there the Australian Public Service. Along the way I volunteered. I won the Senior Volunteer of the Year award in the ACT in 2022, and I'm the chair of the Musculoskeletal Health Australia Consumer Advisory Committee, and I've contributed to research and lots of other different programs and facilities. I've always been what others like to call a bleeding heart, or in some cases a troublemaker, but I can't stand by and let discrimination of any form go unanswered. Over my 51 years working life, I've witnessed many, many injustices, and as a union delegate, I've tried to make management answer for the abject discrimination of staff. For myself, I've turned into a person that medical professions and others either treat like an idiotic old woman or respect my knowledge and skills in managing a number of chronic illnesses. And I must say, with some of the junior doctors at the hospital, it's been very much treat me like an idiot old woman until they find that I actually have quite a lot of knowledge. My self-advocacy started in my early 50s when my manager in the APS asked if I was retiring soon. That shocked me completely. And I asked her if she was retiring soon, as I had as much right to work as anyone. A year later, I developed an autoimmune musculoskeletal disease, and life has progressed from there to a number of other chronic illnesses. This causes huge absences from work, and for sometimes weeks at a time. At first, the workplace is tolerant of your ability to try and work twice as hard to prove yourself to them, and I find that most people with any form of disability work harder and harder and harder to prove that they're worthwhile employees. And I guess too, because we have so much time off work when we get sick, that we try and compensate by working longer hours and work harder. I've got to say, in the first few years after being diagnosed, I spent many weekends sleeping just to catch up and try and regenerate my energy for another working week. And I'm sure anyone with chronic illness or chronic disease can relate to that. The exclusion and discrimination started probably 3 or 4 years after I was diagnosed, and I'd had some time off work. And I realised that it didn't matter how much I worked hard, certain managers, and it's not every manager, it's only certain managers, have absolutely no time or patience for someone who has an autoimmune disease or a disability. And I noticed that every time there was a visit being arranged to one of the Indigenous communities, whose programs I looked after, by the way, my manager would choose someone else from the section or from outside the section to go with them. And at first it made me feel angry and sad that I wouldn't get to meet the people I had worked so closely with and built some really good relationships with. And this continued and continued. And I confronted that manager who said, well, you can't go, you're sick and you might give them something. And I really wasn't unsure of what I could give them, as autoimmune diseases are not communicable. I can't give them rheumatoid arthritis. I can't give them giant cell arteritis. I can't give them my disabilities. So I gave the manager some information to read about my particular disease, but I've got no idea if they ever read it or not. I don't think so, because the behaviours of exclusion and pretty much discriminating against the fact that I had a disability just continued. I was a bit gobsmacked because the APS puts itself out there as such a disability-friendly place to come and work. And I've got to say, as my work as a union delegate, I represented many, many people who had disabilities that were targeted. Many of them ended up leaving or were basically managed out, so ended up with no job at all. And that to me was just unconscionable, that people with disabilities who try so hard are just treated like cannon fodder. And that to me is not equitable. There is no equity in deciding that someone who has more time off than your next staff member should actually be discriminated against in that manner. This behaviour just progressed over the years. And I ended up going to another section where this behaviour continued and became more obvious. And not just to me, but it was obvious to others who'd come up to me and asked me questions about my disability and why I wasn't being involved in certain things, why I wasn't invited to meetings, lots and lots of different exclusionary behaviour that went on. And when it became that obvious, I knew others were watching. But what was happening was they were too scared to act or say anything, because then they became targets themselves. And I did witness that on a few occasions. in my work over the 14 or 15 years I was in the APS. It's slightly different in the private sector, depending on what organisation you work with in the private sector. In the ones I worked in, they were way more supportive of people who had disabilities, and in a genuine way, not in the pretend way that the APS did. Anyway, the manager blocked my attempts to escape this section. I kept applying for jobs all over the place. And I found out later that the reason I would get to the interview, but then I would never get any further when it came to the referees. And because that person was my referee, I found out later when I asked questions that my manager was being quite disparaging about me and my performance. And there was just basically nothing I could do. And I got to the point where I thought, well, they're just trying to get rid of me, basically. And try to manage that emotional damage and the physical impact it has on you and work full time really takes your toll. And by the end of 2023, I just thought, I've had enough of this. By that stage, I also had congestive heart failure, which also added to my disabilities, made me very, very tired. So in the end, I just retired. I just thought, I've had enough. I can't deal with this anymore. And I think, after 51 years of working, I was pretty much entitled, I thought, to have some time out. But what was the final straw from that particular manager for me was I developed a cultural safety program because there was quite a lot of racism within the organisation. And my manager, who was a Chinese woman and who'd only been here since she was a small child, decided that she wanted to take the training because she was more culturally appropriate than me. And I am a woman who grew up in culture. And I found that absolutely disturbing, that someone who, yes, has an idea of what discrimination is because she was discriminated against racially, but not in the form that cultural safety as far as working in a workplace. And that was the other thing, because if you were Indigenous, you really didn't get very far in that organisation. And that to me was a really appalling statement on how they treated First Nations peoples. And that's about me.
I think it would be good to hear if you've got any examples of, like, I think of your story, when people think of restrictive practices, they might not think about the things that we've shared or talked about. I maybe think about it more as like restrictive practice by stealth, like maybe they're blocking you in a room, but they're making sure that you can't attend or get to the things
and that's
everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
Like, they might not be messing with your accessibility equipment, but they make sure you don't have it in the first place.
And that's a big part of the reasonable adjustments and restrictive practices from people who really either don't want to get it or just can't be bothered getting it. And it is the exclusionary stuff that often is the first thing. Like they'll send work out to the rest of the team, but you get to work on a database that is so damn boring, you could probably do it in your sleep if you needed to. That's the sort of, and it's underskilling or de-skilling is what I called it. It's de-skilling people with disabilities. Like you might come in with an amazing PhD in something, you get employed. Then once you get in there, it's like, oh, you've got a disability. Sorry, we can't let you do that work because, that's really not appropriate.
How we imagine people with disability to be.
Yeah.
Go back
Yeah.
in your
Because
corner.
if you've got a disability, A, it means that you're lazy, and B, it means that you're stupid. And that, to me, that attitude is what pervades a lot of the issues that I saw as when I worked as a union delegate representing people, and especially people with a disability, is the fact that it was absolute abject ignorance. The people are like, this is a great example, and this is when I first started being a delegate, was that there was a woman who was deaf, and she got put into a team, and no one would show her or train her on the work that she was supposed to be doing. And that was because she was deaf. Anyway, we got involved, and then they all went off for training into hearing impaired people. Some of them actually learnt sign language, which was fantastic. She was so much happier because she could communicate. And as I said, you've got electronic equipment. There's the chat. You can chat to each other, or you can email each other, or, you know, write it down, the old pen and paper. But it was just, yeah, it was a whole lot of it, I think, wasn't determined discrimination. It was the fact that they were ignorant about what she needed. And it wasn't until I said, you're entitled to reasonable adjustments. And she went, oh, am I? And it sort of went from there. But yeah, that's the sort of, I think, the ignorance of you're stupid and, you know, you're lazy really is such a false statement.
Yeah, limiting people from accessing tech or doing certain activities or workplaces that could potentially, that has real lived economic impact.
Oh, God, yeah.
When it comes to career progression as well, around, I know we've probably both heard in different organizations that we've worked in that, oh, this is such a high priority or high profile project, we couldn't possibly give it
to you.
Give it to you. It's too much of a risk. Like,
yeah. And that's it. They use the old, it's too risky, or, oh, you might be away, or any number of other excuses. And that exclusionary practice is just so bad. And like going back to, it's not necessarily to do with disability, but it's partly to do with that and partly to do with the fact that I am a Nyampa woman. And I wanted to go to this conference, and the blockages that came up were just unbelievable. And it just kept going and going and going. So in the end, I went to the public service, what do they call them? Anyway, it's like the
commission or something.
No, it wasn't the commission. It was the ones that look after things that might be inappropriate for a public servant to do. Anyway, I wrote to them. I asked them, is this an inappropriate thing for me as a Nyampa woman to be attending? And they came back with, what are you talking about? So he rang me first and he said, I'm going to put this in writing to you and it won't be like this. But he said, this is an absolutely ridiculous scenario that you've given me. And I said, well, I've had weeks of this.
Welcome to my life.
Yeah, welcome to my life. Yeah, and I said it is discriminatory. It is very racist as well. And in the end, I just took leave and went. And then when I came back, they wanted me to give a presentation, and I went, no, I'm not giving any presentation. You didn't want me to go. I'm not telling you anything about it. I said, I did that on my leave. There's absolutely no, this is not part of my performance indicators, so no.
Fair enough. Is there any advice that you would give to other mob with disability who experience restrictive practices in their workplace or other settings that you'd want to share?
It is, you're so scared that you're going to lose your job this has been my experience with people with a disability who've come to me for assistance, in that they get so scared they don't want to act, or it becomes such an enormous thing that they just want to leave. And there's quite a few that just wanted to leave, but I managed to talk them into staying. And I think supporting people, showing them the legislation to say, yes, you are absolutely entitled to have reasonable adjustments. You are entitled to be given the work that you should be given, because that is a huge discrimination which goes on. And it's also really, it impacts your career, as you said. It really impacts your career. If you're stuck as an APS 5 or an APS 6 for years on end, they go, oh, well, you know, you're obviously not ready to go up to a next level. And to me, that is just unbelievable. But as I said, the managers all talk to each other. So if you've got a manager like I had that goes around wide anting you to everyone, then it's really hard to progress in your career, and unless you can get away from them. The other thing I was told when I made a formal complaint, because I also made a formal complaint about the fact that that manager told me she was more culturally appropriate than me. I was told that, oh, well, you need to find yourself another job. And I'm like, no, you need to deal with this person because they are the ones that are doing the discriminatory behaviour. I said, and it's also racism. So I then went to the policy, and against every example of what discrimination and racism is, I wrote down my examples and then I sent it to HR. So be your best advocate. Speak up to the right people. Don't just complain to your manager if they're the ones that are doing it. You need to go to a manager higher above, or go to work health safety, or if you're a union member, go to your union delegate. And don't wait, do it immediately. Don't wait around for months and months and months, as a lot of people do. You've got to be active on it, otherwise you just end up falling apart.
It sounds like some ways that the more responsive will work for us is having that like empowerment through education, understanding what your rights are in the workplace in all settings, but also the importance of having so that you can self-advocate, but also the importance of having peer kind of advocates around with you. So like going to you as a union delegate who has an understanding of the exact discrimination that they're facing would have made the world of difference.
And not only that, but I mean, if you are Aboriginal or called, it's so much harder. It is so much harder to go up against the establishment, because we're taught from an early age you don't trust the establishment. So it's also overcoming that form that's ingrained in us. It's really, really difficult for some people to actually do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of your
My
amazing
pleasure.
insights with us today.
So a big thank you to both Angela Brown and obviously Tahlia-Rose joining us at the end to really engage and talk about some of the important aspects around restrictive practices in a way that we don't necessarily talk about in the Western world or in the colonised space. Tahlia, I'd love you to introduce our next speaker, Justin Thomas.
Yeah, I had a great yarn with Auntie Ange, and I've had
My name's Angela Brown.
another great yarn with Justin online over a couple of different sessions, so we get to hear him talk about his experience and the people. And just like Auntie Ange, we never fully explore our own lived experience and applications to one concept such as restrictive practices. We always give you everything around it and make you figure it out for yourself, because that's just the way that we do our storytelling. So next we'll have a presentation and hear from Justin Thomas, who's a First Nations man with cognitive disability, and he's no stranger to adversity and resilience, transitioning his life from jail to becoming an in-demand public speaker and disability advocate. He's currently working as an advocate supporting others in the criminal justice system, and Justin's on a mission to achieve a pardoned criminal past for those with cognitive disabilities due to them falling through the cracks through no fault of their own. So let's hear from Justin now.
Justin, do you want to kick us off by telling us a bit about yourself, who you are?
I was in Minda. My name's Justin, obviously, and my grandfather, how I got Aboriginal connection is that my grandfather was stolen generation. He was born in Granville in Sydney there, which is Darrick. He was, as a baby, being removed down to Victoria, some space there, found out, but I don't know what his Aboriginal real name is back then, but his English name was Ron Thomas. So I carry his English last name, Thomas, even though I don't know his real name after the stolen generation because they renamed a lot of babies and that.
So can you tell us about any restrictive practices you or other people around you have experienced or had?
I was in Minda as a juvenile justice and early institution for kids with problems. They threw a lot of kids in there, wayward kids from the street or family. Lots of kids were Aboriginal kids. In Minda, there were restricted practices happening all the time, and they wouldn't let us communicate with our family, and they would cut us off or get the cops to come look for you.
So the restrictive practices in Minda in the youth justice institution, so they wouldn't let you talk to your family?
Not at all. Not when I wanted to, because I was pretty close to my grandparents, and there was no way they had me to phone to yarn with my family at all. And back then, there was no technology on mobiles. It was a house phone.
Yeah.
You know the old ones? I'm not sure if you've seen them.
With the dialing number.
Hey, there was no voice messages either.
So you'd be trying to talk to your family and trying to connect with them from inside Minda, and they just...
Pretty much once you're inside, you're like a voluntary prison. There's no communication outside world. You're just a vulnerable kid with a disability, and whatever happens inside back then.
And how long ago was that?
I was pretty much 12 or 13.
So what's that? 10 years? 20 years? 30 years?
Oh, don't tell me. I'm maybe dating back, I can give you the year. Probably 88, 89, 90 or something like that, which is way before probably your time.
Make me blush. What other types of restrictive practices happened in that setting? Did they ever hold you down?
I copped hits from both side residents and staff.
And did they give you medication to keep you calm?
Yeah, every time I ran away, they would come and find me and with my family and bring me back to the institution.
How old were you when you were there?
12, 13, 14.
And how long were you there for?
About 4 years.
Is it?
I know people who are not alive today that were abused or end up drug addicts. A lot of child molestation happening. Poverty, children would be subject to abuse, verbal and violent. A lot of them, I copped this from both sides of staff, and yeah, every time I ran away, they would come and find me with my family and bring me back to my institution.
And so when you'd run away, was that when you were in child safety or in the juvenile justice place?
I was a ward of a state back then, which I'm not sure what they're doing, but there was no child safety back then. I don't think it was called that. And
the Protector's Office, whatever they called it.
Because it had a lot to do with Department of Community Services, and they're a bad name. They're a bad label. They're a bad brand because they actually trigger you in the institution of community services.
And I think you've mentioned before as well that there were other restrictive practices like...
I think today they call it the DCJ, but it's still the same brand.
That's right.
They attract the vulnerable kids into that system, and they'll be subject to all that kind of behaviour.
I know that you've mentioned before that there were other practices like maybe they were giving people medications to change their behaviour. Did that happen?
Every time yeah, that's true. they threw a lot of medication, not from me, but I was epileptic at the time and I was having seizures. I seen the wrong medication, which later in life dragged the goodness out of children, and they end up being introduced into drugs, and then later on they come out as drug addicts or methadonians, people who can't cope with the outside world. Not long after that, as they at the time when maturing from child to teenage, where their body and their state of mind changes, that trauma stigma makes people into a drug addict or things like that.
And you think, and that started from sometimes having the wrong medication in some institutions as well, or just
a lot of this and a lot of the abuse that happens in the systems and that, and even for the police force, they use their restricted practice on what they call profiling out in the community and Aboriginal kids and all that. If you reflect on history, TJ Hickey was the evidence of that kind of stigma, and Chris Dungo, whatever his name was, they all been victims of that violating government services.
So all the different institutions, not just
It was supposed to protect them, but really they abused their systems by doing that. It's all connected. Community services they use it as a weapon towards kids and punish them. A lot of kids trauma, mental health, 1 in 3, and they ended up drug addicts because that's all they know.
And instead of being met with support or care, those restrictive practices are used as a weapon outside and inside those institutions, yeah? So you wanted to tell us more about TJ Hickey and Chris Dunga?
Yeah. And how I come across him is that Chris Dunga was in institution with me around my age. The Dunga is pretty popular for a First Nation surname, and a lot of people do across paths with him. I think he was at Minda Manali with me at some stage. I know we crossed paths, but I do recognize that inside mentally, he was a prime target to the enforcement. And as he got older, he wasn't getting the help that he needed. So, unfortunately, they punished him for his mental, his disability behavior, and unfortunately passed away because of the attacks, the force they used on him. With TJ Hickey, young vulnerable kid, he was a pretty young fellow enjoying riding his bike and that, and undiagnosis again, his early intervention should happen. But no, the police chased him until he ran into a picket fence, and it was sad that there was a big emotional day for the area of Redfern, and a lot of people were hurt and reflecting on what happened to old TJ Hickey at Redfern there.
And you think it's important to share their stories so people don't forget the impact?
Yes, the impact of the enforcement that's been brought up on
by the police.
He was probably one of those kids don't like too much attention from police and that. When he hears sirens or something, he run, because a lot of people did back then, and to an extent to chase him into a picket fence, you know.
When there should have been supports around.
Yes.
And appropriate uses of force, if there is.
Yeah, appropriate way is by going through the family and mob.
Yeah. Good. Now we've got their stories as well. What supports do you think our mob should get instead of being in these institutions?
Peer support groups, guiding people back to mob, not being in institutions, support back in family instead of back in institution, and provide support with family with kids. Keep us in our culture. Institution make things worse. Support is better than restrictions, taking to family and mob instead of taking them away. Early intervention at schools. I have just got a behaviour support therapist recently in the last few weeks for the first time in my life. And she's focused on me and my trauma and moving forward.
Thanks, Justin.
I hope that you got out of this something that I did, which is restrictive practices is not just about being institutionalized, but for many First Nations people with cognitive disability, it is sadly the norm that it shouldn't be. And the damage and the expectation that it's okay to do it, that needs to change. It cannot keep happening. I'd love to hand over to Tahlia-Rose to introduce our next speaker, but if you would like to add anything, please obviously feel free to.
I think for me, the underpinning theme that runs across any time we talk to our mob, that happens, you know, when we get together, when I yarned with Auntie Ange, with Justin, and as we've all seen here at COSP, but some other side events that have happened today, focusing on the theme around Indigenous rights and people with disability, has been the importance of our community to each other, and how important it is for us to be empowered to be there, because we're the best placed first responders. We're the best placed to be working with our mob, to be empowering, whether it's educating us, whether it's helping or assisting us or providing us care or support, whatever it is, we can be empowered to do that. And it's not only better for us, it helps us fulfill vital care roles that we hold really dear to us and that improve our own wellbeing over time as well. So keeping that in mind as we work towards strengthening the disability sector into the future. I'll now introduce Daniel McDonald, who you would have all seen his video, lovely artwork at the start. And if you missed it and joined us late, please rewatch this video and go back and watch it, because it's an amazing piece of work. Daniel McDonald is a LGBTIQ plus Wanneroo and Gadigal man, an artist living with disability. He's a visual artist with numerous exhibitions, both in Australia and overseas, with his latest being in Tokyo this year in 2025. He holds a number of positions across many committees representing his mob and people with disability across both worlds, has a role that a lot of us play. And he's a strong advocate for those people, for us mob living and working with disability, especially our deaf mob.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me online. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Daniel McDonald. My sign name is Daniel McDonald. I grew up on Gadigal country. Gadigal is the name of the tribe of the Aboriginal land where I grew up on. I would like to acknowledge everybody here on Gadigal land and who are online here today. I'd like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal elders past and present, and joyfully acknowledge any Aboriginal elders who are here today and brothers and sisters as well. Doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we are all brothers and sisters. My art piece was called Keeping. Keeping means all of us are connected, keeping each other with respect. It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you're from. You are here. Keeping in contact with everyone here today. Who am I? I'm a proud, deaf Aboriginal man. I was born the family deaf. I'm also gay. Being deaf and Aboriginal, I have many layers. That's who I am. Daniel McDonald. You can see that picture when I was a deaf child. There I am I was deaf. I was about 9 in that picture. I can see the photos as I look through from the old days. I could see that I was going to be gay. I was bullied from the other kids. I thought, what could I expect? The way I dressed. You can see in the photos. Maybe I was 6 in that photo, around 5 or 6. Now, with life barriers with First Nations people, there's a lot of barriers with First Nations people with disabilities around Australia. I've made contact with Indigenous people with disabilities and I've listened to their stories and their barriers around Australia. Oh, it's a very difficult time. And to hear their stories, it's difficult because this is who we are. We need to have a strong voice and to be out there telling our truths. And we need to listen to the voices, to their voices. I used art to communicate, and that means I've always been an artist telling my story using my visual and spiritual mind. I was in silence as I grew up, and now I'm out here showing everybody through my art, who am I? Art is my passion. I let people see my art telling my story. And that really makes people see me and who I am. And I can connect with people and they can see my worth through my art. And some of my pieces are quite peaceful and tranquil. When I was a young child, there was other children around. Some were Indigenous, some were white. I was the only child that was deaf. There was an elder called Mum Shirl, and she was quite a famous advocate in the Indigenous community. She did a lot of suicide prevention and Indigenous people in custody, and she took a shine to me and thought, I'm going to talk with Daniel and I'm going to see what are we going to do with him. He's deaf. He doesn't speak. What's he going to be when he grows up? he'll be able to do the art. And now here I am today. I'm telling you my story in depth through my art. Mum Shell was actually my great aunt on my mother's side. And she spoke to my mum and she said, he's going to be an artist. We're going to teach him how to do the dot painting. And we're going to get him to do anything he can. And I do productions now, and I do all different things. I was isolated. I grew up in isolation. It was like I was in a bird cage, locked away, and I just stayed and stayed in the isolation. My wings were like they were clipped for such a long time. I couldn't tell who I was, who I am. I couldn't get out there. I felt that I was so locked away. Indigenous people with disabilities struggle so much. Trying to advocate who's the identity, have equality, who's looking after these people around the world with these people with disabilities. The time is now. There's no more silence. There's no more being hidden away. Silence and hidden away, locked away in that bird cage, is not healthy. There's no more taking our voice. There's no more. We want to be out of that bird cage and see who we truly are, Australia and around the world.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing your presentation and your story with us today, and a bit of your sparkle as well. Would now like to ask you a few questions.
Yep.
First, have you had your own experience with restrictive practices? If so, are you comfortable to share some of your experience with us?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. That question. I started a new position in the hospital. There was a lot of barriers to start with. It's a government job, and they provided me with the job. They said you can do the job. They knew that I was Indigenous and you had a disability. And like, which table do I belong to? Because I was in 3 different tables. I was LGBTQI plus community and deaf. And you know, there's a lot of bad trauma from the past and things like that. So I was advocating with HR about how I was treated. And the worst thing happened to me was COVID. That really got me with the masks. They put me in another position in a call centre. A call centre. I can't even hear. I can't even speak. They put me against a wall with a computer. There was no communication for 2 years. They would not pull their mask down to communicate. There was no touching me. They kept their distance. There was no interpreter allowed to come and interpret. There was no employment access coming. This went on for about 2.5 years. I tried to advocate for myself. I tried to complain. I tried to let them know what I needed. I was just locked away. A person with a disability, it was like I was in trouble. An Indigenous person with a disability, it felt like it was a negative thing as opposed to a positive thing where I was working. And it just affected other people because the morale was down, and then I left. It was a very weak system. Yeah, and I spoke to other people the same as me, and I could see that there was something wrong with the system, and it affected their mental health and mine as well. Australian government won't accept what had happened. Yeah, so which table am I at? The policies did not match mine. It's time now for us to get out of that cage, as I use the analogy of the bird cage. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next question is, are disability provider complaint systems accessible for First Nations people with disability?
Well, that's a good question. I'm very keen to tell you about my experience with an emergency that has happened. Obviously, I can't call. I need to go to hospital. When I did get to hospital in the emergency department, I had a form I had to fill out. Are you Indigenous? And I ticked all the boxes, and they just took the paper away, and that was the end of it. And I just sat there watching TV with no captions, no communication, no interpreter, no Wi-Fi. I didn't even know what was going on. I waited for 76 hours for an operation. I didn't know about my language. Over 76 hours before I had surgery. So almost 3 days. And then I got PTSD, traumatized again. The mask was still on. And people who English is not their first language, very disadvantaged. Because deaf people don't have that. English is their first language, so disadvantaged again, not understanding the words. And some of the questions seem to be silly on the form and not understanding, you know, other bits and pieces. I didn't know what was going on. I ticked that I was Indigenous. But I don't think they put it into the computer system and anybody spoke to me. They said, I said, did you put it on my record to say I was Indigenous, I was deaf, I was gay? Oops, sorry. No, we didn't. We didn't even notice. And I went to put a complaint in, no reply for 6 months. That's me.
Thank you for sharing your experience with that, Daniel. Our next question is, what would you like people working in the disability sector to understand about restrictive practices?
I think that's really important, because I know about many Indigenous deaf people with their experiences going through a difficult time as adults. Even when they were kids, they lived quite far away. They had to stay at boarding school and they were isolated from their families. They never saw their families until Christmas. So year 3 to year 10, they would tell me that they only did that so they were disadvantaged in the language. And when they become adults, they went to look for work. And they were traumatised from their history on going to these deaf schools. And when they were put back in their families, how could they sign? There was no education. The family didn't know how to sign, how to communicate with them. And because they were separated in the boarding school for so long. A lot of people have told me about trying to work. Most people at work were bullied. There was not enough education. Deaf education or disability awareness training or deaf awareness training to understand what's happening with the disability. To understand, you can see that in the workplace. We need more education around the organisations. I think it's very important so everybody understands, so people with disability can keep their jobs and they're not so isolated at home, so they keep their homes and they're able to have holidays. As I say, the time is now for organisations to have more awareness in the disability training. I've just gotten back home from Japan and I flew Qantas and the barriers there, and I had the lanyard on with the sunflowers to show that it was an autism or disability lanyard. So I could be fast-tracked through, but there was no subtitles. I didn't know what was going on. Flight change, didn't know what was going on. And in Japan, the flight, there was more disability awareness for all the staff there compared to Australia. There was none. A lot more access over there. I thought, wow. Support for people with disabilities, looking after us, supporting us. But in Sydney, Australian airport, at the Sydney airport, not much. Even at the hospital, the government needs to do more for this. We just feel so trapped, so silenced. Yeah, I'm working to get my voice out, as I said, for all Indigenous people with disabilities and for myself to get my voice out there, their voice. As I said, it's worth it. The time is now. Thank you.
So hopefully you got to hear and see the story of Daniel's experience and Daniel's life through not only his art, but actually the experiences of what restrictive practices looks like outside of the very specific Western framework that we currently work in. So we're now at a point where we can kind of open up and reach out for any questions or anything that you want to ask. So I'm actually going to stop sharing and move to just Tahlia-Rose and I, and to see if you have any questions for us. Obviously, feel free to either put them in the chat or use the Q&A function. We would love to see or read any of your questions in this space. While you're thinking about questions, and feel free also if you would like to ask them verbally, to raise your hand, and we can put you on screen as well. So while we're waiting and while we're kind of listening for anyone who's got any questions for Tahlia-Rose and I, one of the things I do have for you is, what can people like myself, people who are from westernised, colonised backgrounds, do to make sure that mob has access to what you need within the disability space and the restrictive practices space?
Yeah, I think for us, what's been made clear, I guess, from all the presenters here today, but what we've been saying for a while, is enabling that connection to each other. Even the yarns that we've been able to keep doing what you're doing in this space, for you specifically, and for PWDA, being able to create a space where we can come together and have these yarns and understand what restrictive practices look like to each other, so that we can get more of an understanding of that amongst ourselves, and then participate in wider conversation, is something that we don't have space for, and that we need everybody's help to come together and be able to do that. I think for non-Indigenous people, understanding that you do have a role and accepting that you do have a role to play in bringing our communities together and strengthening our ability to advocate across the disability rights space is something that's really, really important. A lot of Indigenous kind of rights movements and organisations and stuff around the world do have a lot of like a very fundamental health kind of view of the world. In Australia, our largest Indigenous policy frameworks on closing the gap on Indigenous disadvantage, is what it's called back home, is that arose out of a health movement to close health life expectancy gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and it grew into more targets across the socioeconomic outcome sphere. So a lot of our advocacy is still based in that health model. It's still a lot of the language that we use, and we might not even realise that we have a disability and never accessed kind of diagnosis or spaces, or we might not even know we've been subject to restrictive practices because we don't know what they are. We haven't been given space to talk about them. And some of us don't even know that we have rights in the first place. So if somebody's doing something to us and we're being excluded, we literally have that expectation. The amount of marginalisation and racism that we face, compounded with ableism over our lifetimes, comes together in what Scott Avery, one of our amazing Indigenous disabled scholars in Australia, calls apprehended discrimination. Where we go into settings expecting that. So that's the standard we set. So when we receive those, we're not often empowered to fight back, but through initiatives that kind of bring us together around peer advocacy that a lot of people have spoken about today, where we can build each other up. I still think like our communities and our people have the answers and are the best responders to support each other, but having our non-Indigenous and disability allies alongside us to create those spaces for us to have those discussions is kind of the first step.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any questions yet, but I would really encourage you. We've got a few minutes left, so please feel free to ask any questions, especially about anything you're curious from what our panel has shared of their lived experience. One of the things that I really noticed is that when restrictive practices was kind of brought up or discussed, I know somebody who has experienced restrictive practices. It's a very specific set of things, and it kind of is this is the clear cut, this is what restrictive practice is. But what I noticed in the discussions that people had was that it needed to be contextualized in a wider space. And I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable talking a little bit about your knowledge or experiences around what restrictive practices means to you.
Yeah, I think for me, going into this project and elevating the voices of our mob, I very much, over my career and even working in the disability advocacy space, have focused so much on others that even understanding these frameworks and reapplying them to my own life is something that's kind of at arm's length, because it's not necessarily what we do. And even talking now, I'm going around it and talking about community again. But looking back at it, like, there's definitely experiences. It's not until rereading kind of some of the findings from the Royal Commission into the abuse, exploitation and violence and neglect, and the very long title in Australia of our recent Disability Royal Commission. It has a dedicated volume on First Nations people with disability, and there are findings in there around restricted practices use in educational settings, around expulsion of people with disability, suspension, exclusion, saying that, you know, they can't manage them and manage problem behaviours in certain mainstream settings, or not even recognising that they have a disability in the first place, and are just labelling them as bad black kids and expelling them, which leads to kind of a pipeline straight into youth justice and then further incarceration. That when I was reading through that, I realised that even myself going through my teenage years, and I'll talk about it later in the week at another event here at COSP, that what was at the time serious psychosocial disability behaviours that were very present to anyone with a clue was beyond the capability of my school at the time, which is not great. Instead of being asked if I needed support or help, or what was happening at home, and why I was presenting in different ways, I was excluded and removed from the classroom and put in responsible thinking rooms, or responsible thinking classrooms. They rebranded them halfway through, and that in itself is a form of restrictive practice, alongside being given medication that altered my behaviour in ways that only led to more outbursts, because they weren't addressing underlying problems. So seeing and then talking to my wider family about things that they've experienced. When I talk to carers of my cousins that are carers for my other cousins, they often default to talking about educational settings and the amount of restrictions that are still placed on our young people in those settings. So when I think people think about restrictive practices, that seems to be where the focus goes. But I think it's probably not the most common one amongst our communities. We obviously know about spit hood usage in justice settings, in psychiatric settings, of our people being strapped down, and more traditional uses of restrictive practices are probably the most common, but it's what we expect. It's because so many of our families and people have experienced those, we think that's what happens and that's what's normal when you enter those settings. So we don't think of it as a different practice. We don't think of it as a thing that can be taken apart from that experience, and that just happens to us because it's happened to everyone we know. So that I think the silence there, I think, is deafening in how normalised those practices are against our people in those justice systems. It's scary. Yeah.
Look, thank you so much for taking the moment to not just share some of your experiences, but to talk about the problems of normalization of restrictive practices and the expectations of it, that I think that in itself needs to be tackled. Because if you feel that that's what is just going to happen, we're not going to be able to move forward. So I hope today that everyone has been able to not just learn something, but actually it puts a bit of a fire under you to rethink what restrictive practices looks like for our First Nations communities, whether they be in Australia or across the world. And hopefully it'll give you that little spark to include in the conversation whenever you do, around the important conversations that we should be having and broadening restrictive practices discussions.
Yeah, and supporting our mob to upskill ourselves to become peer supports in this space, so that we do understand and are able to advocate for our rights for not only ourselves, but for our families around us as well.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great COSP.